Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's dive in. You're working on your A/B testing. Any questions? We went over data collection last time. A couple questions that have come up recently is, do you need to use matplotlib to visualize, to create your visualizations? No, you could use R, you can use Excel, you can draw it yourself. That doesn't really matter to us. That's perfectly fine. Another thing to keep in mind, we talked about data collection last time. You are running a number of generations, and you're evaluating each individual in the population. So at any one generation, you have n parents and n children. I would suggest that you do not record the fitness of the children. If a child replaces a parent, becomes a parent, great. If you record parent and child fitness and you plot that, you can get a non-monotonically increasing fitness curve, right? Things can go up and down. If you're trying to compare the average evolutionary performance of your A and B code variants, in both variants, most children are going to do terribly. So you're going to get equally bad children in both runs, pretty much no matter what you do. So it's going to decrease or blur or make it more difficult for you to detect any difference between your two code variants, right? So at each generation, you can take either the best parent in the population, or you can take the average of all the parents. Either is fine, but do not take the average of all the parents and all the children. It'll make it harder for you to see if there is a difference, if in fact there is a difference there. Make sense? Okay. Any other questions? All good? Okay. Are people running things overnight on their laptops? Hopefully nobody's laptops have crapped out. We're gonna push pretty hard on your CPU or GPU over the next couple weeks. Let's see what we can do. Okay. All right, so back to our ultimate section of the course here. We're going to look at a few evolutionary algorithms between now and the end of the semester, where in each evolutionary algorithm, what I want you to pay attention to is how the investigators are broadening that evolutionary algorithm to allow it to tinker with more and more aspects of the robot. We're going to finish our discussion today of Carl Sims' original attempt to do this all the way back in 1994, where the evolutionary algorithm is tinkering with the body plan and the controller of the robots. We're going to spend some time today talking about soft robots, where the investigators expanded the evolutionary algorithm again to now modify not just the geometry of the robot, but also the material properties of which the robots are made. So soft robotics is a bit of a misnomer. A soft robot is usually a robot that's made up of hard and soft materials. Where do you decide to put hard, and where do you decide to put soft materials? And then next week we'll conclude with xenobots, where we're going to broaden the evolutionary algorithm again to tinker with many, many aspects of geometry, material properties, and also the biological processes themselves. We're going to look at robots that are built from biological cells. Yeah. As usual, we're looking at a lot of experiments, a lot of experimental details. That's the thread I want you to hold on to as we work our way towards the end of the semester. How do we broaden an evolutionary algorithm so that we, as the roboticists, are making less and less design decisions about what the robot should look like and how it should behave? Yeah? Okay, so back to lecture 24. We were looking at this, what was a very surprising result at the time, years ahead of its time. Carl Sims, computer graphics researcher, built his own physics engine, made his own evolutionary algorithm, got to run it on the Connection Machine 5, a pretty powerful machine, and would still arguably be a relatively powerful machine today. We ended last time by starting to look at the evolutionary algorithm that Carl built around his homemade physics engine. It's got a pretty sophisticated genotype, relatively sophisticated phenotypes for the time, robots where we weren't presupposing the geometry or the number of links and how they're connected together. And we were looking at a relatively non-trivial mapping, the way in which each genotype is translated into a phenotype. We started to talk about this last time, that it's a recursive process. Each node in the graph, which represents the genome for the given robot, that node contains information on about how to build something. And then during this mapping, as we travel outward along each outward edge, the edge is telling us how to change whatever we're going to build next. Yeah, basic idea. Okay, here's some of the gory details. So for each one of these genomes, which is a graph, we have nodes and edges. Each node and each edge has a number of labels associated with them. We start with the node labels. 3 numbers that are inside that node are length, width, and height. You'll notice that all the robots are made of rectangular solids. So whenever we visit a node, we know how to build, we know the size of that object. We're going to connect that object back to whatever object we just built. So there is also information inside about how to create a joint and connect the object we're making now to the object we just built. Yeah. It's a little confusing. You might think that the nodes would represent how to build links and the edges would represent how to build joints to connect them together. That's not the case. An individual node builds one body part and one joint that connects that body part back to the one that was just built, with the exception of the very first node that we visit. The first node is going to build what in PyroSim would be the root link. That one is usually special. Obviously, there's no previous body part, so we just ignore all of the instructions about how to build a joint. Yep. We'll come back to this additional label about recursive limit in a moment. Okay, so we visit this node, and in this case, for example, we build the trunk of the tree, and now we start moving out along one of the 2 outgoing edges. So we've just built the trunk of the tree. Let's imagine we travel along the left outgoing edge, and that edge also has a number of variables or labels associated with it. They are mostly deltas. They are mostly changes. So when we leave a node, we're going to take with us all of the instructions we just used to build whatever we just built. So for example, we're going to take length, width, and height with us as we travel out along this edge. And the delta is going to tell us how to change the position of where we're going to build the next node. It's going to contain information about change in 3D orientation and change in scale. Do we increase or decrease any of the L, W, or H? So far, so good? Question?
So these kind of recursive algorithms can also do you start with an initial body segment before the algorithm even runs, or does it generate that first segment?
Yeah, good question. So how do we know how to start? It's not specified here, but there is one node that says start here. So we go there, and whatever instructions are in there about how to build a body part, that becomes the first or the root link, and then off we go. Yeah? Okay. So especially in the case of the tree here, you can see how change in position and orientation and scale changes. So obviously the edge labels are not actually given for this example, but you can start to guess what some of them are. Some of these deltas shrink L and W and H a little bit. So every time we travel outward along an edge, and when we arrive back at this node, we are building a new object that is a little bit shorter and less wide and less long than the one that we just built. Yeah, and around we go. Okay. Reflection is reflecting about either the x-axis or the y-axis or the z-axis. This biases these genomes to produce bilateral symmetry, radial symmetry. Many, many years after this paper was published, the NEAT algorithm was published, or the HyperNEAT algorithm was published, which we talked about a month ago now. The HyperNEAT algorithm also biases the genotype to phenotype mapping so that as evolution travels around the fitness landscape, the things that HyperNEAT tends to build has symmetries inside, right? Okay, so there's some of the decisions here about how to turn the DNA into a robot are meant to bias the solutions towards certain things, like things that have bilateral symmetry, things that have recursive structure, which are structures or forms that we see in nature. They are generally useful. Why is bilateral symmetry useful in robotics? I mentioned this a few times already. Why is it useful in organisms? We're bilaterally symmetric.
It can reduce complexity.
It can
Reduce complexity.
reduce complexity, that's true. So our genes need to encode less information to build a body plan.
Saves energy.
Saves energy how? It does save energy. Not quite. So internally we are not bilaterally symmetric, which is a strong hint, right? Externally we are bilaterally symmetric. Why?
Increased stability.
Increased stability, yeah. Most of the time, animals or organisms or motile organisms, organisms that need to get from point A to point B, usually it's useful to move in a straight line. It's more energy efficient. If you are not bilaterally symmetric, it is much more difficult. It requires more energy to move in a straight line. So there are very good biomechanical reasons for why you might want to try and bias the evolution of robots to have various kinds of symmetries. Yeah? Okay. Another edge label down here is this terminal only flag. So this is a 0 or 1 associated with each edge. As we're visiting each node and edge, if we travel along an edge and that edge's terminal only flag is set to true, and the parent's recursive limit is 0, we haven't talked about the recursive limit, then we're going to follow that particular outgoing edge. So let's jump back to the recursive limit over here. Every time we leave a node, we are going to, every time we arrive at a node, there is an additional integer, which is this recursive limit. If the value is greater than 0, we decrease it by 1 and follow all outgoing edges. If we arrive at a node and its recursive limit is 0, we build the object and the joint specified inside that node, but we don't follow any outgoing edges, right? So obviously, if we have if we are traveling through this graph recursively, we have to have some way to tell it to stop, or else we would build a robot made of an infinite number of body parts. Yeah? Okay, so as you can see in a lot of these examples here, we're visiting the same node multiple times. How do we know when to stop? When that node's recursive limit is decreased to 0. In that case, when we visit a node where its recursive limit hits 0, there are some edges, the ones that have a terminal only flag set to true. We're only going to follow that edge when the recursive limit gets to 0. Seems like kind of an odd detail. Why did Sims build that in, do you think? So Sims is obviously manually determining how genomes are turned into phenotypes here. And he added in this particular detail. He added in some details like reflection to bias evolution towards symmetry. Why build in this terminal only flag?
If I understand correctly, so that you can end the recursion at some point?
So the recursive limit alone, this piece here is enough to stop recursion, right? We visit it, we keep visiting nodes. For every node, when we hit it, its recursive value is dropping. When its value gets to 0, we stop, with one exception, which is if that node, where its recursive limit has hit 0, if it has any of these special edges where TO is true, only then do we follow those edges one more time.
So that'd be something if you like wanted a foot on the person or something.
This allows evolution to put something special on the end of a recursive process. We don't actually see any here, but you could imagine some of these things having special structures on the end, like hands or feet. Sims threw that in because he thought it might be useful. Make sense? Okay. We haven't talked about the neural controllers of these robots yet. We're only looking at this aspect of the evolutionary algorithm that is going to modify the body plan. Yeah? Okay, so just to make sure we have a good intuition for how this works, here are 12 different robots. I want you, here's the phenotypes, so we're going to kind of do the opposite thing here. We're going to look at some of these phenotypes and try and figure out what the genotype was. What's the graph that produced that phenotype? I'll give you a minute to think about this. Pick one of the 12, and if you've got pen and paper in front of you, great. See if you can draw a graph that would produce that phenotype? Or else just think it through, and we'll try and do a couple at the board. I'll give you a minute to think about that. Some of them are a little bit easier than others. Okay, should we try a couple? Anybody have one they want to try and describe the genotype for?
Wouldn't any of them, like 7, 8, or 9, like the worm or like tadpole type one, they only have like 1 or 2 nodes to them?
Absolutely, right? So 7, it's not completely obvious, but it's pretty clear that, for example, these worm type ones here, imagine we're starting here. We have one node that describes how to build that particular segment. And then we have one outgoing edge that arrives back at the segment. And the change in size decreases the length and width and height, or length or width or height by a little bit. So when we arrive back at this node now for the second time, we're going to build a new node which is a little bit smaller than the one before. Yeah? So we could probably fill in some of the node and edge labels for this one. This one's pretty simple. Probably, you're right, probably same for 8 or 9. A couple others here, you might be able to build a genotype for them that just has 2 nodes.
3 could be a 2-node one probably.
Okay. So 3, we have one node, which is going to specify
The main center body.
okay, the main center body, we'll just call it the torso.
And then you would have 2 arrows going to the wing segments.
The wing segments. Sounds good,
And then
right?
there's a recursion on the wing segments.
On the
Yeah.
yeah, thank you. That's right. So we start here, we build the torso, and now we're going to travel out along the left-hand edge, which we'll assume is also on the left side of this robot's body. And when we get out here, there's information to build this piece and add a joint that connects this piece back to this piece. We follow this self edge, which is going to build this piece. We follow this self edge again. It's going to build this wing tip. And presumably at that point, the recursive limit inside this node has dropped to 0, and we finish building the left-hand side. Questions?
If you put the self edge back on the torso, would that represent 6?
Let's imagine this is a mutation. So imagine we have this genome, which produces this phenotype. We're going to see evolving populations of graphs. Here's 1, here's 2. Like we've seen many times before, surviving individuals in the population are going to produce offspring. They're going to produce a child graph. And during the copying of this graph, for example, a mutation may add an edge, and let's assume it's a self edge. How do you think the child robot is, what do you think the child robot is going to look like? What is this mutation to the genome going to do to the phenotype?
Gonna like maybe make something that looks like 3, just like a couple of them stacked on top of each other.
A couple of them stacked on top of them. So we're going to build multiple torso segments, maybe something like 6, right? So imagine that this self-link creates this torso piece, and then we travel around the self. We build another torso piece and another torso piece. And for each of them, this part of the genotype has been unaffected. So we're still going to build these 2 wings on each torso segment. Yeah, makes sense. Everybody see that? Okay. All right. So that's how we're going to evolve bodies of these robots. let's now look at the neural controllers. I mentioned last time that the genotype is a nested directed multigraph. It's a directed graph because the edges have direction. We are traveling in a particular way. We can't travel back again. It is a multi-graph, meaning that there's the possibility for multiple edges to leave one node and arrive at the same node. It is also a nested graph, meaning inside the genotype for one robot, inside each node, there can be more graph. There can be more graph structure. Yeah? So it's a nested or hypergraph. It's a graph of graphs. Inside the nodes and edges inside each of the larger nodes and edges are nodes and edges that dictate how to create the local neural control for the body part and the joint specified by the outer node. Make sense? Okay, so let's just look at the outer graph for a moment. We actually have this exact picture here. We have one piece here, and we're going out along two outgoing edges, and we have a self edge. Let's imagine that this particular graph here specifies this robot. So we've got the torso segment here, and here's the torso segment. We have a self edge, so we assume we're going to build two of these torso segments. We have two outgoing edges that hit this node twice and build a left fin and a right fin. Yeah? Inside the fin, we create the fin itself, the body part, and remember we also create a joint that connects that fin back to the torso segment. You'll notice we have J0 and J1, E0 and E1. Let's start with the E's. E represents effector, or the motor, if you like, synonymous in our case. We have motor 0 and motor 1, and these represent the 2 degrees of freedom for this particular body part attached by a joint back to the torso segment. When we were talking about joints and motors towards the beginning of the semester, we talked about this idea of mechanical degrees of freedom. Your elbow and your knee has 1 mechanical degree of freedom. Yeah? Your shoulder has 3. Here's 1 degree of freedom, here's the second one, and here's the third one. Yeah? It's not clearly defined in this paper, but in this case, all of the joints are hinge joints that have 2 degrees of freedom. So every time a body part is created and attached to another body part, it's attached with 2 hinge joints. One which can apply force like this, and the other one that can apply force like this, producing something like this, which makes a lot of sense if you're a swimming robot or if you're a walking or running or jumping robot. Yeah? So these 2 nodes inside this larger node are going to become 2 motor neurons. Whatever value is arriving at the E0 neuron is going to dictate the amount of force applied to this joint, and whatever value is arriving at the E1 motor neuron is going to dictate how much force is applied to this degree of freedom. Make sense? In this example, we also are going to create 2 sensor neurons inside each fin. So every time we create a fin, we're dropping 2 motor neurons inside and 2 sensor neurons inside. These 2 sensor neurons are going to detect the 2 angles of the 2 hinge joints. We've usually seen this referred to as proprioceptive sensors before. We have some other neurons in here. We have some other neurons in here that are not sensor neurons or motor neurons. What do you think the symbols inside these other neurons represent? Here's 2 sensor neurons. Here's 2 motor neurons. These are all hidden neurons. Inside each of these neurons, there's something that looks like a function. What is this function? When we talked about the basic building blocks of neural networks, we've got we've got neurons, we've got synapses. Synapses have weights associated with them, and neurons have what associated with them?
Activation function?
Activation function. So like in NEAT, the NEAT algorithm that we saw before, you can evolve, the evolutionary algorithm can also, when it creates a hidden neuron, it can also determine what activation function that particular neuron is going to compute. Question?
So this is pulling from a pool of already existing activation functions, or?
There's a pool of existing activation functions. This is them.
And so it doesn't change, does it change the actual function itself, or just which one it uses?
Which one it uses. So as we just saw before, a mutation can change the graph. It can add and remove edges, or it can add and remove nodes. It can also, for the nodes that are inside, it can change, a mutation can change the activation from greater than to less than, or anything from this list. Yeah. The standard activation function that we see is to compute a weighted sum and then push it through a sigmoid, right? But there's other things that we can do. We can take the product, instead of summing up the value of the presynaptic neuron multiplied by the weight, and then add it to the value of another incoming neuron times that weight. Instead of summing all those, which is the normal way we do things, we can multiply them or divide. There's an arbitrary number of ways that you can combine or compute a function based on all the values that are arriving at a given neuron. This seems like a kind of arbitrary design decision. I'm not sure what Sims was thinking about how that would help, but there it is. Okay. All right, so we have some local neural structure that is inside each of these greater nodes. So during the mapping process, as we take this genotype and turn it into this phenotype, here's a picture of how this local neural circuitry is placed in each of the body parts. Takes a little bit to be able to see what's going on here. Let's have a look at, where is it here? Greater plus, greater plus. So the greater and the plus, this is material that's put inside of one fin. Here's our two sensor neurons feeding into here, feeding to our two motor neurons. That's the neural material that's inside this. So this little local circuit is inside of one of the left fins. The same neural circuit is copied into the right-hand fin. Here's the second left fin and the second right fin. So if you squint at this, you'll see there are 4 identical neural circuits. Those 4 identical neural circuits exist in here, in here, in here, and in here. We also have these 3 hidden neurons, wave, mem, and absolute. And we can see wave, mem, absolute, and another identical copy of it, wave, mem, absolute. Those 3 neurons and their synapses are placed, one copy in here, one copy in here. So as we're building this body, every time we build a new body part and a joint, we are also copying into that body part a particular neural circuit. Yeah? Okay. We have one special node. This node doesn't specify how to build a body part or a joint. Anything that is inside this special node is the non-local brain. It's part of the nervous system that doesn't really exist in any particular part of the body. This decision was made to allow the evolutionary algorithm to put more or less local circuitry inside different parts of the body and create a larger or smaller centralized brain, depending on whether that's useful or not. We are mammals. We tend to have a lot of our neural structure centralized in one particular place. The cephalopods and the octopi in particular did not hit on that particular solution. Octopi have a lot a lot of brain power, but it is distributed through the arms. There are pros and cons to having a centralized versus a distributed nervous system. It's not immediately obvious for robotics whether one or the other makes sense. So like most other things in this early experiment, Sims turned it over to evolution to determine how to balance local versus centralized neural control of the robot. Okay, it's a lot of detail. I don't expect you to remember all of this detail. What's important for us here is to again remember that Sims is trying to take a couple steps back as a designer and allow evolution to alter more aspects of the phenotype, the body, brain, and behavior of the robot than we've seen before. I'll just pause here for a moment. Any questions? So far, so good? Okay. Sims was obviously inspired by evolutionary biology. He's got genotypes that are not vectors. They are graphs. So it is not immediately obvious to see how to cut two graphs in half and glue those two half graphs together to produce a child robot that combines the best features of the two contributing parents. Again, many years after this experiment, NEAT was invented to try and make it easier to cut two graphs in half and combine them together in just such a way that you produce a new graph which has the chance of combining the best of both worlds. This is kind of a naive approach to do this. My guess, although it's not clear from the data reported in this paper, that these two different kinds of crossover events that Sims included in his evolutionary algorithm actually helped. They kind of make sense. You take a graph and you line it up. You line it up one-dimensionally. You take a second graph from a second surviving parent in the population. You string it out one-dimensionally, and then you start walking from the left side to the right side of this sequence now of nodes. And as you do, you copy those nodes and those edges into a child. So you start to create this graph, and you randomly pick a few crossover points. And as you're walking along the parent graph from left to right, and you hit one of these crossover points, you follow that crossover point to parent 2, and you start copying the nodes and edges from that parent, from parent 2 into the child. If you hit another crossover point, you travel back, and away you go. It seems unlikely to me, given the way that these graphs are encoded, that doing this is going to combine useful structure from two parents into one child. But who knows? Yeah. Here's another way to do this, kind of similar, not quite the same. We can do a grafting operation. So if there are two surviving parents, we can take their two graphs, again, string them out as a sequence. And again, we start at the left-hand side of parent 1. We start, as we move from left to right, we copy the nodes and edges from parent 1 as we go. But every once in a while, we mutate and add a new edge. We randomly create a new edge that connects one randomly selected node from parent 1 to one randomly selected node in parent 2. And when we hit this special edge, we follow that edge and keep copying from there. Okay, so we've talked about the genotype, the phenotype. We've talked about the genotype to phenotype mapping. We have some mutation operators that can alter a graph when we produce a copy of it. We can also try and combine material from two surviving graphs. Let's talk about the fitness function. In the fitness functions, in the video you saw last time, Sims evolved walking, swimming, jumping robots, and also competing robots. They were competing over this common resource, and we talked about the fitness function for such a robot. What is it? If we want to evolve robots that can successfully compete for a common resource, what goes into that fitness function?
So, minimize distance from the cube, maximize distance from the cube's distance from the other creature.
Absolutely. So minimize your own distance to the cube. Either go to the cube or bring the cube to you. And while you're doing that, try and maximize the distance from the other robot to the cube. So when Sims evaluated a pair of robots in the same simulation, robot 1 on the left and robot 2 on the right, at the end of the simulation, he calculated D1 and D2, distance of robot 1 from the cube, distance of robot 2 from the cube, and the fitness of robot 1 was higher if D2 was higher, if it kept robot 2 away from the cube, and fitness 1 was lower for smaller D1. So minimize D1. Robot 1 is trying to minimize D1, maximize D2. Robot 2 is doing exactly the same thing. Yeah. That's the fitness calculation at the end of the simulation. At the beginning of the simulation, when Sims took 2 graphs from the population, created 2 phenotypes, those 2 robots had to be on either side of the line. It wouldn't be fair otherwise, right? They also had to fit within this diagonal starting cage. Seems like kind of an odd thing to do. Why a diagonal cage? Why not just put the robot right up, robot 1 just to the left of the dotted line here?
Probably to avoid a strategy where they just fall on top of it.
Absolutely. So you can be sure that when Sims originally ran this, he put R1 just to the left of this line, R2 just to the right of this line, and perverse instantiation took over and evolved robots that would fall, tall robots that would fall as quickly as possible to land on the cube. And you actually saw some of those in the video, right? So some of the design decisions here were probably made after the fact to ward off various forms of perverse instantiation. Okay, last detail we're going to talk about. We now are trying to evolve robots where their fitness relies on the fitness of other robots in the population. So what we're looking at now is a coevolutionary algorithm, which we've seen a few examples so far, right? When one robot does better, by definition, another one does worse. But how do we accurately assess the ability of an individual robot in the population? How do we measure how well it does against other robots in the population? The most obvious thing to do in a population of n robots is to take the first robot, compete it against the second robot, then run a second simulation where you compete the first against the third, first against the fourth, and so on. Then we compete the second one against the third, second one against the fourth, second one against the fifth, and so on. And in all of those simulations, we keep track of the fitness achieved by that particular robot, robot I, against all of its competitors, and that's the fitness of robot I. What's the problem with that? It's going to give us a very accurate estimate of how well that robot does competing against all the other members of the population.
It could do really well against some members and really poorly against others.
Okay, a given robot I could do very well against some and very poorly against some others, so it gets an average fitness. That's fine.
Take a long time.
Going to take a long time. How long? If we have n robots to evaluate each generation, how many simulations do we have to do each generation?
Well, for each member, you need n-1 simulations, right?
Close. For each individual, do we need n-1 evaluations?
It overlaps with other ones, and so
Yep.
it's really like
I always forget this piece, right?
n times n-1 over 2.
There it is. N times n-1. We're going to compete every robot against every other one. But if we evaluate I against j, we don't have to evaluate j against I, because we already know what the outcome of that competition will be. So we have on order n squared simulations we need to run through, right? Most of you have a population size of 10 running on your laptop, so that would be 50 on the order of 100, but on average you'd have to do 50 simulations to evaluate the average fitness of every individual in the population for one generation. You got to do 50 simulations the next generation, right? So pro and con for A. The pro is we get an accurate estimate of the fitness for every robot in the population, but it takes forever. At the other end of this trade-off is B. We pick 2 robots at random in the population, team them up, compute their fitnesses, pick another 2 individuals, team them up. Great. Takes much less time. And we only needed to do n over 2 simulations. We have a population the size of 10. We only need to do 5 simulations. What's the cost we're going to have to pay for that speed up?
You don't get a single winner.
Sorry?
You don't get a single winner.
You will get a single, oh, that's true. You won't get a single winner because we're only having one competition. Good point, right? So there's going to be a bunch of individuals, but remember that the fitness value is a floating point value. So you will actually get a single winner in terms of, at least in terms of someone in the population is going to have the maximum fitness value and someone else is going to have the minimum. What's the problem here? If you ever enter a competition for anything and the competition is run this way, when you enter that competition, you're going to cross your fingers and hope for what? So the easiest opponent, right? Imagine, unbeknownst to anyone yet, I am the second best in the population, and I get teamed up against Krishna, and unbeknownst to me, Krishna is actually the best individual in the population. I lose, and I stand a very good chance of getting kicked out of the population, right?
Does this also not factor in, I don't know what else to call it, but like rock, paper, scissors dynamics? Where like certain robots perform against other robots perform against other robots who like the original?
Absolutely. I am the second best, and I will beat every single one of you here except Krishna, and my bad luck is I got teamed up with Krishna, right? I do particularly well against everyone else, but there's something about Krishna's strategy that I can't overcome, right? So, very quick to compute the fitness of every individual in the population, but it's an inaccurate estimate of the average fitness, how well each robot would do against all the other robots in the population, right? We're trying to evolve robots that don't outcompete one robot, but have a good chance of outcompeting lots of different kinds of robots, right? So in this experiment, like in March Madness, we create a tournament situation, right? We pair up individuals at random, and the winner goes on to another competition. So even if you win or lose, you're going to have to compete again. Although it still has this problem of the second best being knocked out of the competition early by the best individual. So this still is not very satisfying. What Sims actually came up with, and the results that you saw in the video came from case D here, which he refers to as all versus best. How does all versus best work? In the first generation, we're going to do all versus all. We're going to compete every robot against every other robot. It's going to take us a while in the first generation, but at least we have an accurate estimate of every robot's fitness. In the second generation, we're going to perform n simulations where we compete, or n-1 simulations, where we're going to compete every robot against the winner from the previous generation. N-1 simulations, so pretty fast. How does all versus best fix the tournament approach? We get a much better estimate of robots' fitness in here, in D compared to C. It's not perfect, but it's a better estimate. Why?
Kind of like evens the playing field since everything's competing against the same like constant.
Absolutely, right? So everyone, at least among the n-1 competitors, the challengers, it's a level playing field for them. And it's also putting increasing pressure on the best individual, right? So there is pressure, evolutionary pressure here, for the best individual to be the best generalist, right? If this best individual survives multiple generations, it's going to compete against a growing number of robots until somebody else, some other robot, unseats it. And then that robot is in the hot seat, and it can only stay there if it's able to outcompete large numbers of other robots with potentially diverse strategies. Okay, that's one way to do things. We talked about the relative costs of speed here. The other thing Sims looked at is doing a true coevolutionary algorithm, where he created 2 separate populations of robots and then looked at 3 of the 4 different ways of competing one robot from population 1 against robots from population 2. We can do all versus all, but if we have 2 populations of n robots, it's still a pretty heavy cost in terms of speed. We can again randomly pair up 1 robot from population 1 against 1 robot from population 2, but we still have the same problem that we're not getting a very good estimate of the average ability of a robot to outcompete other robots. So Sims settled back on this process of best. The best robot from population 1 only remains the best if it can outcompete all the robots from the other population. Yeah? Okay. Let's have a look at G here. Here are 4 different evolutionary runs performed under G. We're going to draw the best robot in the population from the black population and the gray population in this case. In the third run here, individuals in the black population here achieved much higher fitness than the gray individuals, and the gray individuals were never able to recover. What's happening here, do you think?
You know, like get stuck in like a local minimum where like team 1 was just dominating team 2 and there was no good way for it to get out.
Good question. So perhaps the gray population is stuck in a local optima. Maybe. Remember that we have a coevolutionary algorithm. We do not have 2 fitness landscapes. We have 2 fitness Cs. What was good at one generation, what was high in fitness at one generation, may be low in fitness at another generation. So local optima is actually hard to kind of define in a coevolutionary algorithm. However, clearly something is stuck here. These individuals are consistently achieving very low fitness. They're losing out to the individuals from the black population. What's happening here?
Is it just that like the gray doesn't do well with a certain type of evolved robot that black became kind of?
Absolutely. So maybe it is a local optima, right? Whatever strategy the gray robots have, it does terribly against the individuals from the black population, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that the strategy among the gray population is bad in general, right? There may be also a series of mutations that could occur in the gray population that would eventually get out from under the hammer of the black population, but at least after 100 generations, those mutations were never discovered, yeah? This happens all the time in nature. We talked about the Canadian Arctic, and you have rabbits and lynx that are oscillating, but there are cases where coevolutionary struggle between 2 or more species, one species drives the other one to extinction. The difference between nature and this experiment is usually if one population does drive the other one that it's in competition with to extinction, it's often not a good solution for the other, for in this case, the black population either. Especially if the one that you're locked in a coevolutionary struggle with is your food source. Yeah? Happens all the time. Coevolutionary dynamics get very complicated very quickly. Even in this simple coevolutionary simulation at this point, you can see that if we rewind the evolutionary tape 3 times and run the same algorithm forward again with a different initial 2 populations of random robots, we get very different solutions. Yeah? Okay. Any questions about the Carl Sims experiment before we move on? Okay. Published in 1994, this was far ahead of its time. In a lot of robotics conferences to this day, it is expected that if you stand up and start talking about evolving bodies and brains of robots, you better explain how your approach is better than Carl Sims' approach from 1994. And I've been to many such conferences, and in my professional opinion, most people, including members of my own group, have a very hard time proving how their approach improves upon what Carl Sims did many, many years ago. Okay.
Could you give an example of something that somebody did do that improved on the approach?
Absolutely. Let's do that right now. Okay. So we are going to switch now and talk about soft robotics. Some of the experiments in this set that we're going to talk about today, in my opinion, advance over what Carl Sims did over 25 years ago. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions. Yeah? Okay. Why evolve soft robots in the first place? Like a lot of our discussions about robotics, let's start with the why, and then we'll talk about the how. We've already mentioned our eight-legged friend once already in this lecture. Carl Sims is someone that's hard to come up with something that's better than. Octopi are also a species where when you think you have an idea about how to do something better than an octopus, think again. Has anyone seen this video before? Yeah, there's a few like this. They are pretty cool, absolutely. It gets stuck for a moment here. Does anybody know why? The beak. There's one hard piece of an octopus, which is its beak. The diameter of this hole is just a little bit wider than the diameter of the beak. So it's able to get through, it just takes it a moment, and off you go, right? Okay. We have soft parts, but we have more hard parts than soft. I challenge you to try this task. Not going to end well for a typical mammal or primate, right? Okay, so octopi are cool. They do lots of interesting things. We're going to focus for a moment on one of the advantages of being soft, which is a biomechanical reason, right? It's easy to escape from narrow apertures. Professor Cheney used to be an undergraduate here about 10, 15 years ago. He took this class. A couple of years after he took this class, he joined a group at Columbia University that was developing at that time a soft robotics simulator. We're going to talk about that soft robot simulator in a moment. We talked about what we could do in evolving the bodies and brains of soft robots. What would be the advantage of evolving the body plan of soft robots? An obvious thing is inspection robots. We'd like robots to be able to get into places that are very hard for us to get into otherwise and inspect or unclog. Nick evolved some pretty amazing robots that are able to escape from tight spaces. Yeah. I don't have the video for you, but if you get on YouTube and Google these three last names together, you should be able to find the video and watch these soft robots. Again, not doing quite as well as our octopi friend, but getting there. Yeah. Okay, so that's the why. One why for soft robots. What are some other applications where soft robotics might be useful compared to a rigid robot analog? Any ideas?
Medical procedures.
Medical procedures, right? One of the most difficult places for robots to get to are very narrow apertures and also parts of the inner human body. There's a lot of work at the moment to create micro soft robots that someday, and not too distant a day from now, you might actually swallow a robot pill, and that soft micro robot would deliver medication to a place in the human body that would be difficult to reach if you swallow a traditional old-fashioned non-robot pill. There is still a challenge, or there's many, many challenges about realizing this kind of technology. One of them is the ick factor, which I can see most of you responding to right now. Depending on what's wrong with you, you might very well be willing to swallow literally and figuratively this technology. Even if you do, there are significant challenges of a technology about swallowing a micro soft robot. What are they?
Has to withstand like high acidic environments.
Absolutely, right? So the inside of an organism is a pretty harsh environment, but we know how to build artificial materials that can resist acid, that can resist huge temperature gradients, that can move through tortuous tunnels like your intestinal tract or maybe even blood vessels. Still, there's a problem with this technology.
Able to safely exit when it's done.
Safely exit, okay. Luckily, our anatomy allows that to be not too difficult.
Power source?
Power source. So the robot's going to have to take its power with it, right? No cables, thank you, please and thank you. Yeah, okay. Even if we solve those problems, there is still one major problem. Navigation, also difficult, right? The inside of the human body, there's a lot of branching passageways. How does the robot know which way to go? It turns out that our old friend Bratenberg can actually help us with that problem. Navigation is actually not too difficult. How would combining a Microsoft robot with a Bratenberg control strategy help? We've got a micro robot that's trying to navigate the human body and take medication to a particular site. A lot of the things that can go wrong in the human body, especially cancer, cancerous tumors give off cells. They emit material and signals that can be sensed by existing robot technology. Imagine we create a Microsoft robot that is going to swim up the gradient where it is smelling and sensing and following increasing signal that is dictating there is a cancerous tumor nearby. Again, this is not quite possible yet, but it's not that far off. Some of these technological challenges are going to be solved in the next few years, maybe 5 or 10 years at the most. There is still one showstopper that challenges this technology.
Getting stuck?
Getting stuck, possibly. Yeah, that's true.
Ethical testing?
Ethical testing, so regulatory hurdles, absolutely. That's probably going to be the limiting factor for sure.
Our immune system?
Our immune system. The one thing that the human body hates above all other things are very small amounts of metals and plastics. Our body can excrete, get rid of things that are stuck. We can solve the navigation problem. We can solve the onboard power problem, probably in the not too distant future. Sidestepping the immune response is really, really, really hard. What is a possible solution here?
Make the robot out of your own cells.
Okay, we will talk about that next week. Yeah? Okay. All right, so potential applications. Some are possible now, like inspecting very small pipes, inspecting motors or filters on engines, vehicles, wave farms, wind farms. A lot of places where you would like to get something into a very small, hard to reach place. Soft robots might be helpful there. Okay, so let's switch from the why to talk about the how. We've got about 15 minutes left, so we'll probably just get partway through this discussion. Back in 2014, Hiller and Lipson published a paper describing a soft physics engine, or a physics engine that simulated soft materials. They did it by taking a finite element approach. If you've taken an engineering course, you might have come across this term before. There's a whole set of what are known as FEMs, or finite element methods, where we're going to try and simulate a complex system, something that's very complicated. And in order to do it, we're going to literally divide and conquer. We're going to break it down into very small pieces, and we're going to simulate each of those finite elements interacting with other elements. And if we make those elements small enough and we get the interaction between them more or less right, we should get reliable bulk behavior. In this case, we're going to try and simulate a mass of soft material. So think of a piece of deformable rubber or a beach ball, something that is soft and deformable. We're going to try and break this down into a bunch of finite elements and then define features of those finite elements so that when we simulate a whole bunch of them together, we get something that looks like the behavior of a piece of rubber or a beach ball or whatever soft material we're trying to simulate. In this case, the finite elements are going to be voxels, three-dimensional pixels, which we've seen before. I'll show you some animations of those soft robots in a moment. Here's already an example of one of these soft robots built from a whole bunch of voxel elements. Yeah? Okay. So let's see how this works. We actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there's a 7th voxel inside here. We have these 7 voxels. Here's the graphics of a whole bunch of these voxels put together. So this is not a robot. This is just a piece of material. The red and the blue, what are the red and blue representing here? Forget the rainbow colors for a moment. Strain, absolutely, right? So some of these pieces are more deformable than others. You'll notice that the red voxels are deforming a little bit more than the red voxels. So this is a demonstration that with this particular physics engine, which we're going to talk about in a moment, we can not just simulate soft materials, but we can simulate materials in which different parts of the material have different material properties. Yeah? Okay. How do we do this? Let's take our simulation up here of our 7 voxels, and imagine we take each of these 7 voxels, we leave their position, we leave them in the same place, we just shrink them a little bit. Hidden from view in the simulation, there are actual beams that are connecting neighboring voxels together. What is a beam? A beam like you would expect at the macro scale, so steel beams. You can think of this beam as a type of spring. So we've already talked about springs before. Springs have 2 values associated with them, stiffness and damping. Those 2 features determine how this spring resists being pulled or pushed away from its resting length. Yeah? Okay. Imagine we take a spring and instead of pulling or pushing, we also twist it. A spring doesn't really, those 2 numbers, stiffness and damping, don't really tell you how or whether the spring will resist torsion, twisting one end relative to the other, or shearing. We can take the 2 ends of a spring and I can push or pull the edge orthogonally to the direction of the spring, right? A beam is going to resist in a particular way, pulling and pushing. It's also going to resist torsion. So if you take a steel beam and you hold either end and you try and torque it, it's going to resist that just as much as it's going to resist pushing and pulling. And finally, a beam is also going to resist the attempt to try and shear it. Everybody see that? So we're not going to go more into the math, but just for our purposes, I want you to think about each connection between neighboring voxels. Those 2 voxels, for example, this voxel and this voxel, they are resisting being pulled apart from one another. They're resisting being pushed towards one another. They're resisting being twisted relative to one another. And they're also resisting shear. Yeah? There are many more than just stiffness and damping coefficients associated with each beam. By setting those values to different values, we can create beams that are easily pulled and pushed but resist shear and torque, or they're relatively amenable to torque but not shear or translation, pushing and pulling. So all sorts of combinations we can make. And we've got a whole bunch of these beams. We can set different values for different beams, which when we put all of this together creates a material that has interesting material properties. Everybody see that? So in my little GIF down here, the blue voxels are relatively stiff. You could think about this as steel. All of the little beams that are connecting neighboring blue voxels together are very stiff. They're resisting all 3 of these different ways of relative motion between neighboring blue voxels. The red voxels are also connected with beams that are much more accommodating. They allow much more translation, shear, and torque of the neighboring red voxels. What happens where we have steel connected to rubber, blue connected to red? At multiple points inside this material, we have a blue voxel attached to a red voxel. We have to simulate the interface between steel and rubber. How do you think we do that in this physics engine?
Maybe average all the coefficients.
Absolutely. We'll just average the coefficients together, right? Good enough. Okay. For those that are interested in physics engines, there's the citation. You can go and read all the nitty-gritty details of how exactly they pulled this off. Okay. My group has extended this original simulation, which when it was published was called VoxCAD. We've extended it now to run on GPUs, and we renamed it Voxcraft. You can go and actually try this out yourself. Here's a video of the front end for Voxcraft. Voxcraft, like PyBullet, is made up of two pieces. There's the physics engine and also the graphics. There's a third piece to VoxCAD and Voxcraft, which is a CAD system on the front. Instead of evolving robot shapes and behaviors, you can actually specify your own voxels, where those voxels go. I'll speed this up a little bit. Where those voxels go. And by choosing different kinds of voxels, you're basically choosing voxels with different material properties. Blue here represents stiff voxels, and red represent flexible voxels. Blue is steel, and red is rubber. Okay, I'll skip ahead a little bit here. We're going to now take that design and drop it into the physics engine itself. And we've got an interesting 3D geometry. Inside that geometry, we have a distribution of different material properties. And we've now moved from simulating materials to a robot. It's moving. So we've added in motors somehow. When this work was first published, they were nicknamed the Jello bots for obvious reasons. How do you think you add in motors and actuation to a physics engine like this? Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna attack the beams. We're gonna try and add motors into the beams somehow. Where the motors, remember, are always outputting some value, right? The motors are often receiving a command from a neural network, or the motors are getting commands from somewhere, and they're outputting a value or they're outputting a force. The motors are trying to do something. They're trying to do something to the beam. What is it that they're trying to do to the beam? You're right, they're modifying some of the coefficients, some of the parameters that describe that beam. Which ones? It is expanding and contracting, but how? Remember, the beams are like a fancy version of a spring. We actually saw some experiments where people were combining motors and springs together.
Just like changing the spring constant.
Changing the spring constant, right? The resting length. So in simulation land, this is a little bit unrealistic, right? But the motor is somehow changing the rest length of the beam. The beam is going to try and relax back to a longer beam, or a twisted beam, or a sheared beam. The motors are manipulating the beams. The beams are pushing and pulling on the voxels. And when we go to render an animation of this, instead of moving the voxels apart, we just draw the voxels as being larger or smaller. Yeah. So the visualization that you're seeing, it's not really an accurate representation of what's going on in the underlying physics, but it's kind of close enough. However, as budding roboticists, you should now be very nervous about the sim to real gap. Right? Spent a lot of time talking about the reality gap. It's already hard to get rigid robots to cross the sim to real gap. Things get even more challenging when we try and do this with soft robotics. The reality gap problem is definitely not solved for rigid robots, and the robotics community has just started to tackle sim to real for soft robots. And I've been involved in that effort. Here's a paper we published with some colleagues from Yale just 3 years ago now. Here's an attempt to create a physical version of some of these voxel bots or Jello bots. In simulation, these are voxels attached by beams. There are no beams in the physical robot. Instead, we have hollow voxels. The walls of each voxel are made from soft, flexible silicone. My office is on the other side of this wall, and I forgot to bring one of the voxels today. I'll bring it next week, and you can have a look. Each individual voxel is deformable. If you push and pull on these voxels, you can increase or decrease their volume. And if you supply some very lightweight cabling, you can push some air into the voxels or remove some air from the voxels. Here's a breathing physical Jello bot. This is still kind of a prototype. We don't have Voxel bots that are walking yet. There's a number of engineering challenges, but you get the basic idea. Getting ready to cross the sim to real gap here. Any questions about any of that before we push on? We haven't got to evolution yet, just simulation and candidate technologies that would be able to receive some of our evolved designs. Okay. Here's an example of actually building some of these physical voxel bots. You can try this at home. I will speed this up. A nice thing about silicone is it's a relatively harmless material. It's relatively cheap. You can buy some of it. This is dragon skin. It's a particular type of silicone that's often used in soft robotics. If you cure this material, you heat it up, it's liquid. And we created a little cast here, poured some of this soft silicone into this tray and allow the excess to drip out. Rotate it so that you cover 5 of the 6 sides of your voxels. Add a little bit more in. Spread the silicone so you cover 5 of the 6 sides of the cube. I will skip ahead a little bit. It's like a cooking show. Assume it gets cured, turn from liquid into solid. You now have 5 of the 6 sides of each of your voxels done. Attach 4 of the voxels together. And Sam here is about to hole punch the wall between neighboring voxels. Why the hole punch?
To allow air to come in and out.
Absolutely. So we're going to supply air in and out of this voxel bot. By punching holes in certain walls, we can guide where the air is going to be, and we can, in that way, indirectly force sets of contiguous voxels that are attached together as neighbors, to all increase and decrease together. And we can punch other holes that connect another subset of voxels in the same body to also increase and decrease, but we can pull air out of one part of the voxel bot's body while we add air to the other, and vice versa. Where have we seen this basic idea before? We've seen it a couple times now. We have 2 different parts of the body that are actuating or changing in antiphase to one another. The heart? Okay, so the heart actually is all synchronized. Everything increases and decreases together, which is very good news for us. If one part of the heart decreased while another part increased, then the inside volume would stay constant and no blood would enter or leave the heart, and you'd be in big trouble very quickly. So that's everything synchronized. This is not everything synchronized. This is some things synchronized with each other, other parts synchronized with their neighbors, and the 2 parts in opposition to one another. It's a general principle for motion. Our bodies are also built this way.
Certain gaits, like when we're looking at walking.
Yeah, when we talked about legged locomotion, right? We saw subsets of legs that moved together and 2 sets that moved in antiphase to one another. Yep, so definitely for locomotion, this matters. This basic strategy exists throughout your body, not the heart. Where? Muscles, right? We talked about agonist and antagonistic muscle groups, right? Muscles can only pull. So when your bicep pulls, your tricep relaxes. When your tricep pulls, your bicep relaxes. Pairs of opposing muscle groups, right? This is what allows you to stay upright when you stand on your 2 hind legs. Okay, so basic principle here, but applied to these soft voxel robots. I'm going to take some more of this dragon skin, which has been heated up in liquid form. And before it can cool down enough to solidify, we're going to use it to close these voxels with the 6 and final sides. So we now have a 4 voxel bot. Sam's going to cut it loose here and finally apply some very small hollow cabling. Make 2 copies of these. Take a standard syringe off the shelf and supply air to get it to move. We're 1 minute over. My apologies. You have a quiz due tonight. You're working on A/B testing. We'll see you back here next Tuesday. Have a good rest of your week.